Hello and welcome to the Australian Roundtable podcast. It is Sunday the 23rd of November 2014. This is episode number 7 of our weekly broadcast, live at youtube.com/Australian Roundtable from 4pm Australian Eastern Standard Time every Sunday. And also archived on the same channel for later listening if you can't tune in live. I'm your host Johnno, and I'm pleased to be joined in the studio as usual by my co-panellist Ethan Nash of TOTT News. Thanks for being here.
Hello everyone.
And we're fortunate to again have the company of our resident jolly old fit man, the silver fox himself, Lindsay. Good to have you here, my friend.
Thank you.
Now, if you are new to the show, we thank you for joining us. This is a roundtable discussion on news and current affairs, both domestic and international. And because it is independent from commercial or government funding, we are able to actually discuss the truth, which is a novel thing in this day and age. Now, each panel member is solely responsible for his own views expressed on the show, and each is more than happy to respond to any questions or comments that the audience might have, which you can submit on the YouTube channel publicly, or go to australianroundtable@gmail.com privately if you so wish. And of course, today is the first day that we have the live chat available as well. So if you're listening live, check out the chat box and chat with the fellow listeners. Now, episodes generally run for 90 minutes, and timestamps are provided in the info box on YouTube so that listeners can skip to the segments that take their fancy if time is short. Although it's a roundtable discussion, we do try to keep a rough structure for each episode and generally focus on a small handful of discrete topics every week. And I'll get to today's rundown in just a moment. But before I do that, I have to say a gigantic thanks to all of our loyal listeners for your support. During our coverage of G20 last weekend, the Australian Roundtable channel passed 200 subscribers. Our shows are attracting hundreds of listeners each week, and we're receiving more likes and more comments on every single episode we do. And for the audience to grow so quickly, it means that our listeners are sharing links with their friends and with family via social media and direct word of mouth. So basically, we have to say a big thanks to you. You're the ones getting the word out there, and we thank you for that. Keep promoting the show. As you all know, this country in particular needs an alternative outlet for news and analysis, and that's what we try to provide. So once again, thank you very much. Now, on to the rundown. Today, we'll tie up a few loose ends from last weekend's coverage of G20. We'll touch on some of the so-called gender equality issues that were brought up by Obama in his speech. We'll look at some different perspectives of Australian Indigenous history, owing to the fact that we were given one perspective at the protest last week. And we'll also give some final figures regarding arrests made during G20. And then we'll move on to some new topics, some updates on the anti-terror legislation and so-called anti-bikie laws that have passed different states here in the country. And then we'll move on to a feature piece on the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement, which was signed on Monday. Then in the international segment, we'll move on to discuss Iran and some updates to do with that, which will provide a nice little segue into discussing the USS Liberty incident of 1967. And if we get time, we'll use that as a segue to discuss more false flags, this time some of the nonsense that's taking place in America with their so-called school shootings and yet another fake ISIS beheading. So that's it from me for now. Let's get straight into the first topic. And I know that, Lindsay, you wanted to discuss something to do with Obama's speech. Now, the background for the listeners who didn't get to hear this, Obama's speech on the Saturday at the University of Queensland touched on a number of topics. And on Saturday night's live show that we did about the G20, we discussed the fact that one of the things that was brought up was to do with gender equality and getting more women into the workforce. And on the Sunday, we discussed the fact that the communique that was released by the G20 group explicitly said they wanted to reduce the gender gap in the workforce by a further 25%. And we used that as a pretext for discussing second wave feminism in general. And it was a really good chat. Listeners who didn't hear that one, go back to the Sunday episode of the G20 specials. I really enjoyed that chat. I know that, Lindsay, you've got more to discuss as an addendum to that conversation.
Yes. It triggered something in my memory, and I went back through my files, and in 1994, the New South Wales government had an advisory committee looking into boys' education. Now, at the time, I had young girls at high school, and I was on the school committee, and I thought that this is going to be an inquiry into boys' education, because there'd already been a girls' education program on, and suddenly they were finding that the boys weren't interested in school anymore. They were more interested in sport, or they were just turning off altogether. So I'll just try and pick the eyes out of this. I won't read the whole letter that I wrote at the time, but there were some parts of this that really stood out and angered me at the time. So if you'll bear with me, basically the first of the 5 terms of reference established the tone and direction of the report. Now the first one this is a term of reference, was to examine the current policies and strategies across Australia for girls' education and gain an understanding of the impact of these strategies and policies on outcomes for girls. Now, this is the inquiry into boys' education. The second term of reference followed this up with to examine gender equity strategies across Australia and investigate strategies relating to the education of boys contained within the equity strategies. Now, the other terms of reference related to seeking input from interested parties, collection of qualitative and quantitative information on boys' education, performance, and making recommendations within a nominated framework. And at the time I said, poor deluded fools like myself who thought an inquiry into boys' education would actually be an inquiry into boys' education and trusted politicians to do just that, have now found that in practice it was perverted into a report on the progress of girls' education strategy. The recommendations would be to ensure that boys and male culture are controlled so that girls' education strategy is not impeded and community complaints of possible adverse results of this or other policies on the lives and education of boys is deflected. Now, this was made quite clear under the heading of what are we trying to achieve by this investigation. And they said, the emerging debate over boys' education, following as it does some 20 years of feminist thought on the issue of gender equity, provides an opportunity to refocus our goals. The way forward is to develop an overall gender equity strategy involving programs for boys, extension of the current programs for girls, and gender education programs aimed at both. This approach is in line with much feminist thought and will clearly benefit girls and women. Once again, I remind you, this is a strategy for boys' education. To put it simply, most feminists want boys and men to change so that they cause less problems for girls and women and themselves, so the sexes can live alongside each other in a safe, secure, stable, respectful, harmonious way and in relationships of mutual life-enhancing respect. Feminists have long made the case that gender plays a part in all aspects of education, and that to recognise this is to get a particularly useful insight into a lot of educational issues and problems. Now, almost as an afterthought, it immediately concluded with the one sentence: it will be also of enormous benefit to boys and men trapped by expectations which can be limiting and even harmful. Now, inherent in the feminist proposition is the belief that males are only acceptable in society if they change to be docile and pliable. This is hardly a display of mutual life-enhancing respect, in inverted commas, on their part, and could have major ramifications for the welfare of society in general. Under gender and the abuse of power, it speaks at some length of sex-based harassment and power relations which discriminate against girls and women. However, this kind of harassment does not end with boys harassing girls. Boys who do not conform to traditional masculine values are particularly vulnerable. They are bullied, intimidated, and cast out. These behaviours may not normally be recognised as sex-based harassment. Now, my comment in the letter was there was no mention or speculation on what sex-based or power-based motivation there is in girls who are bullied, intimidated, and cast out by other girls, and how this fits in with feminist thought. This may simply be immature behaviour by both sexes and have little to do with power or gender. For those who believe that radical feminist philosophy, far from being the answer to boys' education and social problems, may in fact be a contributing factor to them, the number of single-parent families growing by 180,000 to 619,000 between 1982 and 1992, boys being uncommunicative, boys not wanting to excel except on the sporting field, boys having low self-esteem, and Australia having one of the highest rates of male youth suicide in the world, 4 times higher than for females. And that may have resulted from a constant but subtle undercurrent that says that males are responsible for all the ills of our society. Now, I won't go on anymore. One of the things that did strike me at the time, and those figures were, as I said, from 1994 or something like that. So one of the things that struck me at the time was the refusal of this group to look into the fact that 81% of primary teachers were women at that point. I presume it's worse now. Now, whether that imbalance is causing problems and how to address that, none of these things were done. It was all about feminist attitudes. We've got to incorporate, and what got me was, this was a Liberal Minister for Education.
The Liberal Party, of course, being the so-called Conservative Party in Australia, which makes these kinds of inquiries or these kinds of findings even more obtruse.
Yeah. So I won't go on. There was a longer letter, and I got stuck right in them, and you don't need to listen to that. But the point I made was, I've spoken to people about this at times, and they don't believe that this could possibly be true. But I'm telling you, I read the document that was sent out to the school, and I couldn't believe that they were putting this rubbish out.
Yeah, anyway. And again, we're a news and analysis roundtable, but also just a roundtable where we discuss society and the trends that we see. And we didn't plan to discuss feminism at all in last week's coverage of G20. The reason why we got into that discussion was because of the findings of the communique that they want to get even more women into the workforce. And of course, most of us, I think, agreed last week, and many of our listeners would agree, that taking more women out of the home where they can do so much valuable work and putting them into the workforce isn't a prima facie good. The fact that women have the right to work is fantastic, and if women choose to do that, that's great. But why is the G20 communique saying we're going to take more women out of the home where they can do good work and put them in the factories? Well, I can think of one particularly good reason, because when they're in the factories, they're doing work that you can tax. Whereas when they're in their household, what work are they doing? They're doing really important work for society, helping nurture and raise kids, but it's very hard to tax that, isn't it?
It is, exactly.
Well, these findings are very interesting. As you said, there's could be a ton of underlining issues that are associated with what they're speaking about, but they just focused on one particular thing. And in a broader spectrum of things, that's to reinforce the notion of feminism and pushing all of these things to destroy the family unit and do all of the higher agenda to it. But it just seems like that was meant for a reason, that they did this report just for that. It was very interesting.
Yeah, and just the fact that so many boys are committing suicide. I remember at the time that was upsetting me. I mean, my children were girls, but it's first of all, you've got to look at them. They don't want to be marrying boys who are screwed up because of the system. You want your daughters to marry reasonable, strong young men, not people who are on the verge of committing suicide. It's just anyway. I was appalled by that, because now there is no. If people are coming back now saying we want an investigation into boys' education, oh no, we had that back in 1980, or 1994 or 1998, and it was purely a Clayton's investigation, and now they can say, oh no, we've done that, we don't want to do that again, and nothing's been fixed.
Yeah, and one of the great problems when you try and destroy the idea of gender roles is it doesn't just harm one, it harms both. And I'm sure we have some listeners who might be saying, oh well, don't discuss things in a binary of gender. There are other groups as well. This is to say nothing of groups who don't want to identify as one sex or one gender. This is just to make the comment about society. If you take away the gender roles, which worked for so long, and replace that with an androgynous society, teach all the kids to be the exact same, that these differences or that differences, they're completely social construct. Cultural Marxism is what we're talking about here. Yeah. It destroys societies, and the metrics that we can use to measure things like health, mental health or physical health, the relationships between people, social capital. There are metrics that we can use to measure society, and all the metrics are going in the wrong direction. Yeah. And is that a coincidence?
Yeah. One of the things that upset me at the time, I remember thinking back at saying, what is the arrogance of these women to assume that all the matriarchs that have gone before them were stupid and didn't know how to look after their families or their society or whatever. No, they're not stupid. I find it's just insulting.
Well, the problem is it's not just the women. I mean, a lot of the most radical so-called feminists, second-wave feminism, which is so different to first-wave feminism, they're men. There are many men who argue against gender roles. Why? Because that's what they're brainwashed into believing at school, and particularly in our universities and the arts and the social science faculties. They're brainwashed into believing that gender roles and family roles and the society as it previously was all a construct. And not just that, it was all a bad construct for the people. Well, look at the people today. Look at depression rates. Look at medication rates for depression. Look at suicide rates. Look at the breakdown of society. Look at the fact that most people don't even know their neighbours. This cultural Marxism, this idea that we shouldn't have gender roles or family roles, if those were social constructs, okay, but what if those were constructs that made people better off? I mean, even if they were social constructs and they were entirely, from the people pretending to be certain ways, or whatever the cultural Marxist argument is, if people were better off that way, and so many metrics suggest that they were, why are we brainwashing people into believing that we shouldn't have those roles? Yeah. Someone's benefiting. That's the point I always make to people. Yeah. Someone's benefiting from breaking down society. Someone's benefiting from teaching women that their job isn't to be a good mum or a good housewife. Someone's benefiting from teaching men that their job isn't to be a good husband or a good dad. Someone's benefiting from all of this. Who is it? Well, we don't have time to go into too much detail today, but we did discuss this a lot last week on that Sunday show. I recommend listeners go back to that. And hopefully over coming episodes, when we get more time, we can spend more time really deconstructing this idea that second wave feminism is a good thing for women. Because on every metric that you can think of, it's proven to be the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. No. Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. I think cultural Marxism is the perfect term to sum it up. And as I said last time, I do look forward to spending a whole episode going into a big feature about it, because then we could talk about this for a whole show. We could dedicate a whole show to it. So I definitely look forward to it, because as you can see, the contrary is that even if it was a social construct, it's not benefiting us in any way, doing the complete opposite.
Yeah, so it's messing people right up. Now, we have to move on because we've only got 90 minutes on the show. We want to move on to the next topic. Again, we will come back to the whole cultural Marxism, second wave feminism thing in a future episode. But for those who are interested, check out the Sunday show from last week, because I thought the discussion on that was really good. Lindsay, thanks to you for bringing that one in. Now, I know you've got more stuff for us, again, tying up some loose ends from last week. Yeah. Now, the viewers who listened to our Saturday G20 special last week would have heard our discussion about who was leading the protests against G20. One of the two main groups of the protest leadership was the Indigenous Australian group. And, of course, much of what they were saying at the rally before the march was very much anti-white stuff. I mean, it was blatant racism that some people forgive because it's blacks being racist towards whites and saying how the whites have destroyed their community, which might well be true. This is a debate about history that I think is healthy for people to have. But you can only have a debate when you get both sides. Now, I know that, Lindsay, you've brought in another perspective that some people might find controversial, but that's what we're here for. We're here to discuss what we think is real and then get the facts on the table and people make up their own mind. I was taught a certain version of history at school. I think Ethan might have been taught a very similar one to what I was. What you're about to present might be controversial to some, but you're entitled to your views, and at least until they take the internet away from us, Lindsay, we're allowed to use it to discuss alternative viewpoints. Okay. So please take it away.
Okay, thank you. And I don't really want to be inflicting my voice on people for forever. But when I went back to have a look at the last, a letter that I'd written about the gender education, I also found this letter and a few others that I'd written about Aboriginal, because there were various things going on. Religious people were making adverse comments about the whites in a small country town because of their attitude to Aboriginals, not employing Aboriginals, etc. So this letter had a part of that. And then I got a letter back really coming down and heavy on me. So this is what I wrote. I won't read the whole thing to you, but I'll just pick little bits and pieces out of it. When I was young at school, I was given to believe that Aboriginals were a gentle people. That's what we were told. And that's what we were told the other day down at the G20. They kept making that point, that we were the devils and violent, and they were actually a gentle people. Now, that then led me to investigate cannibalism in Australia. And I'll go on with that in a minute. But the other point too, well, it's not just cannibalism, but the killing of small children. That was what the High Mast Bridge business was all about. That secret women's business was they were killing mixed race babies and things like that.
Can I just, before you go on, we do have many international listeners, which we're very happy to have on board. We should point out that Australia was settled by the British back in the late 1700s, and one of the prevailing narratives, at least today in schools, is that when those settlers came, they decimated and destroyed the Indigenous communities. Yep. It's probably worth giving that background. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but that's the background to what you're about to say now.
Yeah. Okay, so, and I'll go through a little bit of that because there is quite a lot. When I wrote this letter, I was inundated from people from all over the country, and it surprised me. Here I am in a small country town writing a letter to the local newspaper, and I got letters from Brisbane and Sydney and everywhere else telling me that I was lying. There was no such thing as cannibalism in Australia, etc., etc.
Haven't we come so far now? You write a letter to the local newspaper and you get letters back.
Yeah.
Well, we're live on air right now, so
Yeah.
our inbox could be filled with hate mail already.
Yeah. Anyway, so so in my reply to these people, one of the things I made was that if you've never heard of cannibalism amongst Aborigines, there are a whole list of books, and I'll quickly read out a few of them. You had Manning Clark's History of Australia, Hector Holthouse's River of Gold, Daisy Bates, The Passing of the Aborigines, a lifetime spent among the natives of Australia. And she did another one, The Great White Queen of the Never Never. Mr. Lumholtz, Among Cannibals, account of 4 years' travel in Australia and camp life with the Aborigines of Queensland. And that was from 1889. Cannibalism and Human Sacrifice by Robert Hale. Then you've got Eric Rolls' Sojourners, the epic of story of China's century-old relationship with Australia, which this is in North Queensland. The Chinese came in to mine silver and gold, and they were being eaten left, right and centre up there. Then we have Tom Petrie's Reminiscences of Early Queensland, written by his daughter in 1904. And he spoke a local Aboriginal language. He'd almost been adopted by these people. But he made no qualms. He said they were most certainly cannibals, however, as they never failed to eat anybody killed in a fight. And they always ate a man noted for his fighting abilities, or a Tuawan, a great man, no matter how old he was, or even if he died from consumption. On the other hand, for the consumer's own benefit this time, a young plump gin, and that's his wording, would always be eaten, or anybody dying in good condition. Now, in other ways, he spoke very highly of them. He had a lot of affection for them. There was another man called Zach Skyring from Gympie, and he was in the same boat. He'd lived with them, and he spoke about their capacity for brutality. And that was printed in the Gympie Times. Anyway, I won't go on about this. But one of the points I like to make too is that we'd been led to believe that the Aboriginals had been here for 40,000 years. And then suddenly it jumped to 140,000 years. And then down at the meeting the other day in the G20, they were saying it's not 140, it's hundreds of thousands of years we've been here for, etc., etc. Now, the point I'd like to make was that Captain William Dampier, when he landed in Australia in 1688, described the Indians, which is what he called them, he saw near Cape Leveque, Leveque, as their hair is black, short, and curled like that of Negroes, and not long and lank like the common Indians. The colour of their skins, both of their faces and the rest of their body, is coal black, like that of the Negroes of Guinea. And I've got this book at home, The History of Australian Exploration by Ernst Favenk, Favenc, and it was written in 1888. The point I'm trying to make there is that, and Australians in particular may remember this, there was a Lake Mungo finding of the remains of an elderly woman and a young man, and they were said to be 7,000 years old. Now, all the women's magazines and all the popular publications throughout Australia call them Aboriginals. But when you go into the scientific works, it turns out, no, they weren't Aboriginals at all. They were Papuans, the Papuans that were here before the Aboriginals came. And I find that interesting. The only other point I was also making was that there was some talk about Professor Elkin, who was quite famous in Aboriginal research. And they were talking about shell middens, or piles of crustacean shellfish that were left behind after having feasts. And these were supposed to be thousands upon thousands of years old. But apparently there was a group of scientists who went there, and they were set back because, I think it was in 1973, this anthropological research team collected various samples of these ancient campsites, and when they were carbon dated, the results was catastrophic for the academics. For all they could show was between 600 and 1,100 years of occupation by Aborigines. So it's not as if it's just one-off thing, Dampier or it all seems to be pointing to the fact that you had a Papuan race with short curly hair and a very negroid features well before the Aborigines. So it may be that the Aborigines have only been here for 1,000 years, and they've either killed or interbred or driven out the original inhabitants. Now, if that's the case, then it's no wonder that the publications and newspapers in Australia are trying to stop this, because if the general population in Australia were to believe this, they may then think that the Aboriginals have very little more claim to Australia than what the whites have. Anyway, I won't go on anymore, but it's just, I can't say this is true. I'm just quoting you what I've read, and we'll have to make our own minds up.
And again, as always, all the information that we provide links in the info box underneath the video on YouTube. So if you quote a text from a book, or if you quote a newspaper article, whatever, if anyone wants to verify what you just said for yourself, because you just read out a verbatim quote from the text, they can check the quote themselves. What you just read out isn't simply your opinion. This is what was written by scholars or by researchers in the past. I noticed when you were going through the list of books that you said people can check, a lot of them were from the 70s or earlier. It's almost like there's no work being done into this field over the last few decades, which would make somebody who is an inquisitive person wonder, why isn't this discussed anymore? Well, that might be because of the opinion that you put forward. This doesn't really help certain narratives that are pushed on people today to affect certain agendas.
No, I appreciate you bringing that information in, Lindsay. I've heard about that briefly, but I haven't obviously researched into it as much as I have. I have researched into alternative perspectives on Indigenous history, and one that I have has been the notion that Indigenous people in Australia evolved into Homo sapiens before Africans did, and then there was a notion that they then walked the rest of the planet to, enlight people or whatnot have you, and then that ties into cave paintings and evidence down south that has suggested that Egyptians did travel to Australia and did interact with Indigenous people, which for most, I during my schooling years was the dux of my history class and everything. If you wanted to bring that up in modern day history education or anywhere else, you'd be called crazy. But there are alternative perspectives to history everywhere, particularly Indigenous Australian history, and that's something that definitely needs to be discussed. Everything needs to be put on the table, because we're being told one side of history from the textbooks, and every textbook has someone writing it that's controlled by an agenda. And this is why it's so vital to provide alternative information and for people to make their own minds up. So I do appreciate you bringing that in, because as I said, I've looked into others that may refute that, may refute the mainstream, you know what I mean? It's just, it's hard when majority of history has been, covered up and morphed and skewed to, serve certain people. But I do thank you for bringing that in.
Can I just make one other point? I personally don't have, when I talk about cannibalism, I don't have any problem about it. If that's what their forefathers did, then the people today have got no responsibility what their forefathers did, just as we haven't. I mean, not very long before the Englishmen came to Australia, there was the Battle of Culloden in Scotland, where they went through and raped all the women and killed all the men, went and got on the grog for 3 days and come back and beat anybody else that was alive still to death.
This is the British, you mean?
The British, yeah. And that wasn't very long before they
came to Australia. You're not sitting here saying that the British were good people, or that they were. You're not making anything like that claim at all.
No, but I don't have to apologise for something that the British did 300 years ago, and these people today don't have to apologise for their forefathers being cannibals or whatever. That's just the way it was. But don't deny reality. That's my thing.
Yeah, that's a terrific point, and that's where my interest in this comes into it, is because there is a narrative that's being taught that is essentially anti-white, and it's divisive. And the big problem with the protests last week, with this particular Indigenous group leading so many of the protests, was it was divisive. It was saying, we, the Indigenous, or the descendants of the Indigenous, are the victims. You, the white people, the descendants of the settlers, are the perpetrators. And all it does is create a barrier between, we're all the peasants. I mean, the white peasants generally are more wealthy than the Indigenous peasants in this country. But for the most part, we're all the peasantry. I use the term peasantry intentionally as well. I mean, we can discuss this more in future episodes. But we have far more in common with our Indigenous brothers and sisters at the bottom level of society than you or I do with some of the white people at the top, just because we have the same colour skin. And to suggest otherwise is fundamentally racist. And yet, based on what you were talking about for a few minutes there, and the fact that we're on the same panel, people accuse me of being the racist. It's fundamentally absurd, and it's driven by this agenda that's pushed through schools of blame the white man today for the crimes of the white man of the past, because they push this narrative of these friendly, harmless Indigenous tribes when when the British settlers got here. And what you're saying is there's another perspective, like go right to the heart of their narrative at the very heart of their narrative is possibly a false narrative.
Yeah.
And how can people make up their mind if they're not exposed to these ideas? Which is why I'm so happy that we have you on the panel. You have different interests to what I do and to what Ethan does. You can provide a different perspective that not only should people hear, but people should be allowed to hear, which is why I think it's so important we have you on the show.
Definitely. So that's why I said, it's definitely important to have different perspectives, and it's vital to discuss them. It's vital to discuss them because every single day we're being told, what to think and not how to think. So.
And who to hate. The Indigenous are being told to hate us. Yeah. And naturally, many white people say, well, I didn't do anything wrong. And that leads to hatred that goes back. And it's keeping us divided. Which is exactly what certain people at the top want. Now, people will accuse us of saying, but if you say that the Indigenous were cannibals, you're being divisive. If you say the Indigenous only arrived here 1,000, 1,500 years ago rather than 40,000, you're being divisive. On the contrary, what we're trying to do is break down this narrative of the bad guys coming and hurting the good guys, and people 200 years later being responsible. We reject all of it and say, hold on, we've all got far more in common than we realise. Let's get the truth out on the table and then start looking at our real enemies, because it's the white man's enemy isn't the black man, and the black man's enemy isn't the white man, despite what they try and teach us in school.
Fantastic point.
Now, we'll have to move on because the show is only 90 minutes. The next one on the agenda is finally tying up the final loose ends to do with G20 before we move on to other topics. I wanted to talk about the final figures about G20 and the protests. Now, of course, in the lead up to G20, the mainstream media, and in particular the Courier Mail, which is the only newspaper that's a daily here in Brisbane, were outright hysterical in their prophecies of doom regarding the G20 protesters, police arrests, etc. And we laughed. Oh, how we laughed at the front pages and the headlines of the Courier Mail talking about anarchists, invasions and ferals and etc. We had a lot of fun. We knew it was all nonsense, and it's been proven to be nonsense. Here's just one example of the kind of thing that was being printed in the Courier Mail in the lead up to the G20. This is from the Courier Mail on October 7. Quote, police have been warned to expect a minimum of 1,000 plus arrests and full watch houses during the G20 summit as 5,000 extra officers patrol Brisbane streets. Brisbane Watch House officer in charge, Marcus Cryer, told staff to be calm, patient and very understanding, and warned of significant issues due to the event. And that was under a headline of Brisbane G20 police told to expect a minimum of 1,000 arrests at the summit. That was on October 17. Now, in our Australian Roundtable podcast specials across the G20 weekend, we noted how orderly and downright impotent the protests were, and how little work the police even had to do. And the official figures from G20 have been released. Let's go through them. This is from the Brisbane Times, which is a Fairfax publication. Quote, 2 years of preparation, 6,000 police officers, a 24-hour G20 court with room for 150 people in its holding cells at the Federal Court Precinct. In the end, the biggest peacetime security operation in Australia's history has finished without a hitch. Just 14 arrests, almost exclusively non-protest related, and 27 exclusion notices issued. End quote. So thousands of police were flown in from not just around the country, but also from our friends over in New Zealand, and hello to any Kiwi listeners that we have on the show. Months of MSM propaganda about the terror posed by anarchists and so forth. 14 arrests, 27 exclusion notices. Now that would be comical enough, but to put that in perspective, let's compare it to what is happening on the Gold Coast for Schoolies Week as we speak right now. Now for our international listeners, Schoolies is a little bit like spring break in the US, except that it's for school leavers who've just finished high school. And these are mostly 18-year-olds who have just finished high school, which is obviously a wonderful time to be alive. And it's also the legal drinking age in Australia. At 18 is when you can legally drink, so Schoolies is obviously going to be a big thing. Now, in many parts of the US, the drinking age is 21. Here it's 18. And that also happens to be the age when you get your license in Victoria. So how do you like that? You turn 18 and they say, now you can legally drink. Now you can legally drive. Be safe now. Anyway. So the many sites around Australia welcome large numbers of schoolies every November, December, because that's when our school year finishes. But the Gold Coast, which is about an hour south of Brisbane here in Queensland, is the mecca for schoolies. And here is an article from this morning recounting the events of the first night of schoolies, which was the Friday night. This is from a news article. Quote, 19 teenage revellers were arrested in Surfers Paradise for drink and drug-related offences. More than 30,000 school leavers are heading for the area for the wild annual ritual, with 20,000 expected at tonight's parties. Queensland Police said they arrested 18 males and 1 female on 23 offences overnight. A further 42 schoolies were issued with liquor infringement notices for drinking in a public place. Police arrested 35 non-schoolies, or toolies, on 40 charges, mainly public nuisance offences, end quote. So do the maths here. 19 schoolies plus 35 toolies equals 54 total arrests on 63 charges plus 42 separate liquor infringement notices on the first night of Schoolies, which is a 4-week event. Across G20, there were 14 arrests, okay? Across G20, there were 14 arrests on the first night of Schoolies, 4 times that amount. What do you think about this?
Ridiculous. And it just, again, proves that the mainstream media use sensationalism and, biased reporting to pump fear into people. Yeah. We saw it. Brisbane was a ghost town. Businesses were down generally in most areas. The Courier Mail. The Courier Mail was the worst one of them all. And just, we've discussed on the show every week, the front covers with these futuristic Photoshop, photos of armed police and everything. And this is what I mentioned in an article, and I'm going to expand more on my website, tottnews.com. We're going to, go in to say, look how much of a waste of money this is, because the mainstream media said that. The mainstream media were the catalyst for then all of this to roll out, for the draconian laws, and then for the increased spending, the militarization police state in Brisbane, because the police said it's going to end up because the mainstream media, said that it's going to end up like this. And then when nothing happened and we said that we're going to be peaceful protesters, the BrisCan organisers said we're going to be peaceful, we're not going to cause any trouble, the mainstream media still hyped it up. And then this is just absolute proof that the mainstream media, if this isn't the final nail in the coffin to make you believe that the mainstream media say things to cause and effect for their own agenda to sell publications, then I don't think there's any way that I can prove it to you.
Talking about that, yesterday's paper, we've got a Palmer United Party, which is a third. It's a bit like everywhere in the world. You have your conservatives and your socialists or whatever, and they hate having a third party or a fourth party in there because they like to, I suppose they're both controlled, so they don't care which one gets in. But if you start having third parties, anything can go wrong. And it's the same in Australia. And so we have this Palmer United, and they've got this fella, he's an ex-footballer, quite a big man, but they got him painted in green, and he's done up like, what was that? Oh, it won't come to me. The big fella that used to burst out of his clothes and turn green.
Hulk.
Yes.
The Hulk.
Yes.
Lindsay.
But except they called him the Sulk.
And
that's the sort of rubbish.
There is a massive media campaign, not just the commercial media, but also the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is government funded, to destroy the Palmer United Party. And I've been wanting to do a piece about this for a while because I see it almost every day. There's another hit piece on the Palmer United Party. Now, our regular listeners will know that I, and possibly you two as well, despise all 3 of the major parties, Labor, Liberal and the Greens. I'm not here to defend the Palmer United Party. It was founded by a billionaire magnate who probably has very little in common with me. But obviously he's not part of their controlled agenda, which is why the mainstream media is doing their best to destroy him. But I don't know how you segued onto the pup party from what I was talking about.
Sorry.
We'll do a proper thing on pup at a time in the future. But going back to what Ethan was saying, there is a symbiotic relationship between the government and the police and the media. If the government and or the police union want more police, they'll use the media to put the fright into the people. If the media puts the fright into the people, they'll demand more police. And so you can see that both have something to gain from this. The hysterical articles that the Courier Mail was printing almost on a weekly basis about anarchists coming and doing all this damage. They're going to profit from their sensationalism. The police and the government profit from being able to pass through draconian laws and what have you. And the two of them are just treating the average person like an idiot. And so long as the average person watches the news or reads the newspaper and thinks that it's there to inform them, well, they are the idiot, and some would argue they deserve to be treated that way. The problem is there's no alternate voice, which is why shows like ours and any other shows that might crop up are so important. And that's why I always make the point to people, hey, if us 3 can get together and do a show like this, anyone can. And I'll tell you this right now, I'd rather listen to any one of our listeners who are listening to this right now. I'd rather listen to your podcast and your analysis of the news and current affairs than to watch a 6 p.m. bulletin. And there is a small but growing number of people out there just like us who are saying, hold on, the mainstream media, it isn't just that they're distracting us. It isn't just that they're lying to us. They're part of a much bigger campaign to harm us. Stuff them. I'd rather listen to real people's opinions on things.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The mainstream media, and we said there was a workshop at the G20 People Summit where I disagreed with a gentleman there who said that the mainstream media, he doesn't think that they're the overarching thing. Well, no, we're controlled in all facets of our life, through pharmaceuticals, through financial, through banking systems. But the media are the only thing that keeps this in place. The media are the glue, because they tell the people this is how it's supposed to be. If the media turned around one day and said this isn't how it's supposed to be, think of how everything would change in an instant.
Yep.
Think of Vietnam. When they showed people what was happening in Vietnam, how did the people react? Now they don't do that. They've learnt from that. You see, the media, the power of the media is so important in this whole grand scheme of things, and that's why alternative media is also so vital, because we need to do the same thing to get real information out and get past the spin and deception.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The amount of power that the mainstream media has to influence opinion is phenomenal. And what interests me is that when I went through university back in the day, I did a course on communications, a subject on communications, call it whatever you want. And basically, when we got to the topic of media influence over people, we were essentially trained, no, people are very intelligent, they make up their own minds. The media has some influence, but mostly people just read what they want to hear anyway. The media doesn't have that much control, and I believed that for a long time. And what really opened my eyes to how much of a fib that is was how easily people were influenced to hate Putin and thinking that he was responsible for that MH17 that was shot down. How quickly, just from a couple of days of mainstream press that was anti-Putin, people were so quick to blame him for the plane coming down before an investigation had even started. And that was when I thought to myself, hold on, this is phenomenal. If the commercial media, 7, 9 and 10 in this country, the newspapers and the radio, get together with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a government-funded organisation, so long as they all stay on message, they can put out whatever message they want, and for the most part, it works.
Yeah, certainly does.
Yeah, and it's specific techniques that are taught to journalists. It was taught to me when I was trained. How to induce fear to manipulate public opinion, because it's not just manipulating public opinion. The media have created the public opinion in the first place. This is the point. Muslim hysteria, all Muslims are terrorists, all of these things that are general public opinions, everyone on Centrelink's a dole bludger, all of these notions in Australia that are generally widely accepted are because of the media and the establishment saying that this is the notion, by a current affair putting up stories about this, by constantly being pumped into you. This is what happens. So they create the public opinion in the first place to be manipulated, and journalists are trained how to do that. It's blatant.
Yeah.
And we discussed this a couple of weeks ago with that pickup artist Julian Blanc, who was deported from this country, having committed no crimes, or at least being charged with no crimes. And it was because the media had whipped people up into this hysteria about him and demanded that something be done. Classic Hegelian dialectic. Problem, reaction, solution. They do it all the time and they get away with it because people aren't wise to it. But that's where the internet is so powerful, because you can spread this message. I didn't learn about the Hegelian dialectic by watching Channel 7, 9 or 10 or reading the Courier Mail. I heard about it through social media online. Someone saying this, someone saying that, linking to an article, reading about it. Hey, that's interesting. Let's do more. The internet is the most powerful tool that we, the peasantry, have probably ever had in our possession. And that's why we have to fight to keep it. And part of that fight to keep it is to use it. So you know what? If we have a guest on the show one day who has different views to me, views that might be cast as being misogynistic or racist or whatever epithet you want, if those are his views and he's done some research to have those views, I'm glad he's here. Let's use the internet. While we've got it, let's just exercise your rights. If you want to keep your rights, start by exercising them. So again, I'll make this point again, and I'll keep making it every show that we do. Listeners, microphones don't cost much money. Mine cost me like $100. I think this is a Blue Yeti that Ethan's got in front of us right here. Probably cost you, $150? The software that you use to do the podcasts, it's either free or you could find it for free. It's not hard to put one of these shows together if you want to. And the more of us who do it, the harder it's going to be when they decide to try and shut us down.
Yeah, that's right.
But we have to move on because time is of the essence now. The next thing we wanted to talk about was an update on the anti-terror legislation. Now, I know, Ethan, you've brought in some more information for our listeners who are new to the show. Episodes 2, 3, and 4, you broke down the anti-terror legislation that was brought into this country over the last few months fantastically well. I recommend people go back and check that out. You've got some updates for us on that anti-terror legislation.
Yeah, I do. This is for the third bill, the final bill, the data retention bill that was introduced by the government late last month. It was introduced after the passing of the second legislation, the foreign fighters bill. So both legislative pieces, the main ones I've talked to, have passed and are now law in this country, unfortunately. But I haven't been giving an update on the data retention because it still hasn't been referred to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security for consideration as of yet, and that is suspected to be delayed until at least February, which is at least good because this is starting to get some debate. You know what I mean? This is starting to actually have people stop and think about it, contrary to the first two legislations, which were just whipped up, read, non-debated, and swept through. And then all of our rights just majorly diminished with that. But I just want to touch quickly. I found some interesting news whilst reading up about some of the legislation, some of the new developments with this legislation, because obviously people present their views and their debates while this is being constructed. And Australia's corporate regulators have warned that the government's new data retention regime could hamper their ability to investigate white-collar crime. Now, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission and the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, said the federal government's proposed new data retention laws could prevent them from gathering personal telecommunications data for use in investigations. Now, for people that don't know what the data retention scheme is here in Australia, they've introduced that they want to store everyone's telecommunications for 2 years mandatory. So all of the telecommunications of everyone, the data will be stored, and then an archive will be built for 2 years on you, whether you've committed a crime or not. Information it has gathered as part of investigations of corporate crime in the past, including basic information on telephones and emails, will not be able to be obtained for investigations under the new regime unless it's given special clearance by the government. So you may think to yourself, well, this is fantastic. They're being held accountable, you know what I mean? They actually have to seek approval, because here you can just gather data warrantlessly. You don't need a warrant to gather if you're a government agency, Centrelink, Medicare, whatever. So this is great, but then the interesting part is that a spokesperson for ASIC, which is the Australian Securities Investment Commission, said that the regulator has made a number of approaches to the government on the issue in relation to how this will hinder the, quote, investigation of insider trading, market manipulation, and various forms of financial services fraud, which will be impacted by the new laws. So I just wanted to just quickly touch on this, because already the data retention is a complete nightmare. This whole introduction, how it's going to eventually pyramid down to affect the people, how we're going to endure the costs of this because of the telecommunications companies having to store it and then increasing the prices and whatnot, and other things, the data facilities and whatnot that we're going to all have to pay for. But I think I just wanted to say this is really interesting, how not only can they take something bad, but then they can also skew it to benefit themselves in amongst it as well, where now it's harder for insider trading, market manipulation, and financial services fraud to be investigated, and these companies that investigate have to get approved from the government, who in most cases throughout history are the ones partaking in this. What do you think?
Yeah. I it sounds like a crack record, but that's an acronym too, isn't it? Sorry. But I come back. They never do one thing. They always do two or three things.
Yeah.
So they've done that. They've benefited themselves at the same time as screwing us. That's
the perfect example.
Yeah,
you've mentioned it in previous episodes. That's the perfect example, because not only are they being able to store all of our data, they're making it harder for companies to gain data, which could investigate things that, as we've said, it's shown that they're usually partaking in each other.
Yeah, and very quickly it's becoming the case that you have less and less privacy as an individual. The government gets more and more of a say of what they get to know about your life and say about your life. At the exact same time as we're getting less and less access or right to investigate the government. I mean, in the ideal world, or at least anyone who believes in what we call small L liberal values, not the political party, but the political philosophy, this idea that people should be in charge of their own lives so long as they're not hurting other people. Well, really, it's the government that should be completely open and transparent. They're here to represent you, and you get to decide how much of your information they get, unless they've got reason to believe that you're harming someone. Yeah. It's been completely inverted now, so that we get we could be charged. Look, we're citizen journalists essentially here. At least we were during G20. We could be imprisoned for up to 10 years for trying to investigate what the government is up to if they declare it an SIO. Meanwhile, if they want to come and arrest me right now without charge for 2 weeks, they can. That's the society that we're living in here in Australia as we speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's the terrible thing about it. These first two pieces of legislation have completely, it's unfathomable. You know what I mean? You could take this trio of legislation and put it in anywhere in history where there was a tyrannical regime or a fascist sort of control grid over the people, and this would slide in like a perfect puzzle piece, these legislative pieces. Absolutely unbelievable. And it goes back to the media control. The media were the ones that, problem, reaction, solution. Here's the problem, well, here's what we need to do, so people amp up about it. We need more transparency so they can track these dastardly terrorists, and it's mind-boggling. But I just thought when you thought it couldn't get any worse, it's getting even worse in the debates.
Yeah, no, well, they're trying to keep a lid on it. That's what it's all about. And we've talked before about, Australia is absolutely rotten with corruption, bribing politicians, all that sort of thing. But the media have turned it around so that we all look to Asia or wherever else. Oh, they're terrible over there. No, we're bloody side worse in Australia than anywhere that I know of. And this is another example of it. And you're right. The media can do whatever they want. They just convince the vast, what would you call them, unwashed or unbrained or no, they do. They have control over them.
Yeah, that's what I've that's what I've said before. It's just I got no words.
Your
anymore.
work in breaking down all of these three pieces of legislation has been fantastic, Ethan. I'm glad you did that again. It provides a nice little segue for me to discuss a little revelation that came up on Friday of last week. Now, of course, Friday of the last week was the eve of G20. So it's all of Australia's eyes, certainly the media's eyes, were focused on G20 and things to do with that. So the following little factoid didn't get as much attention. I'm going to read out a quote here from an ABC article from that Friday. Again, this was announced on the opening day of G20. Coincidentally. Quote, Commonwealth prosecutors have dropped 5 out of 6 charges against a Melbourne terror suspect. Adnan Karabegovic was arrested more than 2 years ago during counter-terror raids in Melbourne. The 26-year-old had been charged with possessing several issues of the online Al-Qaeda magazine Inspire. The publication contained headlines such as "Make a bomb in the kitchen of your mum" and "Open source jihad." Karabegovic had originally been charged with 12 offences and placed in 23-hour lockdown in custody, but those charges were later reduced and he was freed on bail. In the Victorian Supreme Court on Friday, prosecutors withdrew the majority of charges, which left a single charge of possession in relations to assistance in a terrorist act and knowing of that connection. It carries a maximum penalty of 15 years in prison. There have been a number of delays in the case. Karabegovic is due to go to trial on the single remaining charge in October next year, end quote. So that was announced on the Friday on the eve of G20 that a guy who was arrested in these terror raids of 2 years ago, these big terror raids, they're out to save us. Well, all of those charges against him have been quietly dropped. So quietly they waited for G20 to announce it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And people are going to try and tell you that's a coincidence. But let's go back to what that was an ABC article, by the way, and again, all of our links will be provided in the info box. You can check this out for yourself. Let's go back to what the ABC was reporting about this guy back when the arrest took place. Quote, a man arrested yesterday during a series of counter-terrorism raids in Melbourne has been taken to hospital. He is expected to be charged with collecting or making documents likely to facilitate terrorist acts after officers with the Joint Counter-Terrorism Team searched properties in Narre Warren South, Craigieburn, Hallam, Officers Springvale South, and Noble Park yesterday. Those are all places in southeastern Victoria, which is where I spent a lot of my time growing up. The maximum penalty for the offence is 15 years jail. Police say they seized a number of items, including computer equipment, imitation registered firearms, and a USB containing violent extremist materials. AFP, Australian Federal Police Acting National Manager of Counter-Terrorism, Justine Saunders, described the arrest as a positive outcome. And this is a quote from Justine Saunders. The result of the operation demonstrates the importance of operations undertaken by Australia's joint counter-terrorism teams and is an example of proactive law enforcement action to prevent terrorist activity in Australia, she said. End quote. So you compare that article from when it happened to what we're finding out now on the eve of G20. Oh, that guy who we arrested, we got nothing on him. We got nothing on this guy. We got one charge and it might get to trial October next year. And when it does and it all gets thrown out, that'll be announced on a day when there's an AFL grand final or some other event.
That's right.
But that's not what matters, because in the eyes of the masses, call them whatever you want, they would have seen 2 years ago. That would have been the front page news, would have been the lead article in the bulletins, counter-terrorism raids, look at all this stuff that's happened. And some of our listeners, especially non-Australians, will be saying, hold on, counter-terrorism raids, didn't you guys have those a couple months ago? Yes, we did. This was from one that was 2 years ago, back when the counter-terrorism raids only involved a few dozen officers. Of course, this year, they ramped it right up. And I want to remind people of what happened back in September of this year. September 18, which was a Thursday, there were massive terror raids involving about 800 police, many dressed in tactical gear and driving around in armoured cars across Sydney and Brisbane, and dozens of homes were raided. 17 people were arrested on that day, and since then, only one has been charged with terrorism-related offences, and the evidence against him is allegedly that he received a phone call where somebody else on the other end suggested that he should behead somebody. Another person was charged with unauthorised taser and 4 bullets, but those weren't terrorism charges. So those 800 police officer terrorism raids a couple of months ago, they netted 1 terrorism charge. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
they got away with it 2 years ago. So then 2 years later, they ramped it up with 800 officers raiding. Yeah. Give it another couple of years, they could have 5,000. They could be calling up all the dudes who came to G20 and saying, hey guys, we've got another job for you.
No.
We're going to find 1 charge against 1 guy, but this time we want 5,000 people doing the raids. And the way they're going, they could probably get away with it.
Yeah, it's not too far-fetched, Lindsay.
No. Well, I'm just thinking about the plastic sword again, too.
The plastic sword.
For listeners who didn't hear that on episode 3 or 4, those raids that I just discussed, there was photos published through our mainstream media and on our TVs of a sword being taken from someone's house, later revealed that sword that seemed so scary was plastic. That's what actually happened.
You can't make it up.
I'm sure some people are listening to this for the first time and going, hold on, these guys, Australia can't really be that crazy. Again, we'll provide all the links. You can verify this for yourself. This is a madhouse. It's like that scene out of Planet of the Apes. It's a mad... Boy, oh boy. All right, so time is quickly running out, so we have to move on. That was the anti-terror legislation update from Myth, and I mentioned how this whole anti-terrorism thing is a complete farce in this country. Yeah. Of course, we've also discussed anti-bikie laws, which is it's the same thing. Yeah. Whether the boogeyman is a terrorist or the bikies, they're just boogeymen. The idea is to take away our civil liberties. Now, we discussed on the Friday G20 special last week how on the same day where they quietly announced that guy had nothing on him, they also announced that the appeal that had been made against the Queensland-specific anti-bikie laws had been thrown out by the High Court. And I wanted to discuss quickly what has happened subsequent to that. Now, we mentioned on the show on the Friday last week, hey, the journalists are also saying to the Queensland Premier Campbell Newman, don't you think other states should bring this in? And we predicted, yeah, of course, that's what's going to happen now. Yeah. Well, let me just get my notes in order here. All right, so we noted on the Friday G20 special that the High Court had thrown out the appeal. Of course, for people aren't aware, the VLAD laws are Stasi-style anti-right to association laws, which allow the state government to declare any organisation of 3 or more people an outlaw organisation and slap instant imprisonment terms on anybody in breach of those laws. And that's just part of those laws. Queensland is, of course, our 3rd largest state with a population of about 5 million people. The biggest city is Brisbane, which is where we sit right now. Now, we also noted on that Friday episode that the immediate line of questioning from the so-called journalists was loaded towards lobbying for similar laws across the rest of the country. And we didn't have a chance to cover it in the G20 specials because we were naturally focused on the G20 itself. But guess what was printed in the Fairfax Press in Melbourne the very next day after that High Court decision, and we predicted that other states would soon follow suit. This is a quote from the Fairfax Press down there in Melbourne. Under a headline, police fear delays in tough new laws are turning Victoria into a bikie Switzerland. Quote, senior police are concerned that Victoria is becoming a bikie Switzerland because the state government has failed to heed requests to hand over sweeping new powers to law enforcement. The warning comes as one of the country's fastest growing outlaw motorcycle clubs, the Mongols, staged a run into Melbourne on Saturday that police sources complain they were powerless to stop. Police are pulling their hair out, a high-ranking source told Fairfax Media.
Oh my God.
It is understood that senior police have been asking the NAPFEN government for more than a year to introduce new laws that would require licences and fit and proper tests for the heavy haulage and debt collection industries, which are increasingly being targeted for bikie infiltration. Police have also been asking the government to consider implementing Queensland-style anti-association laws that could prevent large numbers of bikies congregating in runs like the Mongols did on the weekend. We are concerned that without these laws, Victoria is becoming a bikie Switzerland compared to Queensland and New South Wales, the source said. End quote. So again, on the Friday, they announced that the appeal to the High Court was thrown out. We predict that other states will follow suit. The very next day, the Fairfax Press print what I just read out. Now, I'm not going to read that article in full, but it gets even better. Again, go to our info box, check this article out for yourself. here's a part towards the end of that same article that I just read. Quote, Detective Senior Sergeant Iddles criticised both major parties on their law and order platforms ahead of the election, there's a state election in Victoria coming up, for their failure to commit to increasing police numbers on the beat. You can postal vote starting from Monday, and neither side of politics has made a commitment to police numbers, he said. End quote. So again, this goes back to that symbiotic relationship. The police will tell you how dangerous it is out there. There's all these problems, all these bikers, all these boogeymen. Everyone's in big trouble. We need more police numbers. And the media prints it. And yet people still think that they can trust the mainstream media as unbiased or objective. The police are just talking their book and the compromised media going along with it. Now, for international listeners, Victoria is our second largest state, population of about 6 million and growing rapidly. And it's clearly only a matter of time before they get their own so-called anti-gang laws. Our largest state is New South Wales, population about 7 million and growing. And in early October of this year, they also won a High Court challenge against their so-called anti-consort laws. This is from an ABC article from earlier in October this year. Quote, the High Court in Canberra has upheld the New South Wales anti-consorting laws, which make it an offence for convicted criminals to repeatedly associate with each other. 3 men who were charged under the laws mounted the challenge on the grounds that they infringed the implied right to freedom of association in the Constitution and that they were at odds with Australia's international obligations. The laws were set up in 2012 to target bikie gangs, and the New South Wales government argued they served a legitimate end. Today, the court found the laws are valid and there is no such right to freedom of association. It also found that although the laws do impinge on the freedom of political communication, in this case they are an appropriate measure in the prevention of crime. The court also dismissed claims the laws were at odds with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights because that was not in the Commonwealth legislation. The article goes on, the laws carry maximum penalties of 3 years in jail and a $16,500 fine for people who repeatedly consort with convicted offenders after being warned by police. 2 of the men behind the challenge belong to the Nomads bikie gang, but the third man is not a bikie and was charged with consorting while grocery shopping with his housemate. The laws were introduced in the 1920s to tackle Sydney's razor gangs, but were later scaled back because of concerns police were abusing their powers. The New South Wales Parliament revived them in 2012 in a response to a wave of gun violence involving bikies and organised crime groups, but police said the legislation was never just intended for gang members. End quote. So let me just give a recap of everything I've just read out. Our largest state, New South Wales, has anti-consorting laws which, among other things, can be used against non-gang members for grocery shopping with the wrong people. Our third largest state, Victoria, Queensland, has VLAD laws which can, among other things, outlaw any group of 3 or more people and place the burden of proof on the defendant. And now our second largest state is already, that's Victoria, already shaping up to do similar, just as we predicted on this show a week ago.
Yep. And it's important to reiterate that the Queensland VLAD laws don't have the word bikie anywhere in them, but they're anti-bikie laws, is what the media have said they are. They don't have bikie anywhere. It's association with a loosely based definition of a criminal organisation. Yeah. New South Wales have had those laws in for ages. Now, because of all of this, because of the snowball effect that is happening, it's coming back up to light. It's coming back to light, and now they can skew them to also fit that. And now, just as we predicted, other states are following in suit. Victoria said that they want this to stop bikies, just like Queensland and New South Wales have. Our legislation doesn't have the word bikie anywhere in it. It's not intended for bikies. It's intended for the general people. You're going to stop. It's madness. This is complete madness. And that article is just rubbish too. Listeners at home, you should have seen my face. Like, police are pulling their hair out, sources reveal. Like, where is this? Like, it's just, and people are getting away with this, and people are being, subconsciously programmed to accept this as the reality when, in all in order, you know what I mean? Like, there would be people down there in Victoria saying, it's working in Queensland. Look how it worked, blah, blah, blah. Look how this is happening. It's been validated by the High Court. We need to stop the bikies down here.
And in the vast majority of cases, you can say to them, why are you so scared of bikies? Have you had a run-in with them yourself? Well, no, but I mean, they're a big problem. Well, why are they a big problem? Well, because don't you watch the news?
Well, when I remember last weekend at the demonstrations, the G20, I was talking to a fellow there holding a placard about bikies. And when I discussed it with him, he said, no, the High Court didn't validate the laws. They just threw the case out because the people that came before it had no standing, because they hadn't been arrested. And that's all it was. They haven't invalidated the laws. They haven't not invalidated the laws. They've just thrown that particular appeal out.
Yeah, I agree with you. I guess the thing is, if you look at what happened with the High Court, which, like you pointed out last week, is the equivalent to the Supreme Court in the US, they're the white guys at the top, they didn't reject New South Wales's anti-consort laws. Again, this is anti-association laws, and they even said there is no implied right to freedom of association. I mean, we don't have a Bill of Rights here in this country. All we have is implied rights, and that's our High Court saying, no, you don't even have those implied rights. This is happening today in Australia.
Okay.
And I think if more people... there are some people out there who have no sense. They have no concern for themselves or for their society. They're just lemmings. Okay, cool. But I think there's a big latent group of people out there who, if they realised what was happening, would start to arc up about it, and this would become important to them. And I guess that's why independent media is so important. We can get this information out to people. I mean, some of our listeners, I kind of feel for them because we've discussed so much of the federal anti-terror laws. Of course, there were 3 separate bills. Each one of them was draconian that was passed. Now I'm sitting here talking about the state laws. Yeah, this is a full press attack from our federal government and our state government in consort with the media. And you have to ask yourself, is this a coincidence, or is there a reason why this is all ramping up? Not just here, but in Canada and other members of the Six Eyes as well. Why is it happening now? If you think it's a coincidence, I don't think there's much hope for you. There's an agenda at play here, and it is heating up very quickly.
Yeah, okay.
Definitely.
Can I, when you're talking about a Bill of Rights, there was a parliamentary inquiry in New South Wales quite some years ago now about introducing a Bill of Rights in New South Wales. And I put a submission in because we have got a Bill of Rights from Britain, 1688. And the Queen takes her coronation oath and she guarantees in that oath to uphold those rights that we've got. We just don't know about them and we don't enforce them.
Yeah.
And these clowns, well, in that Bill of Rights, it gives them parliamentary immunity for anything they say in Parliament. So they can't divorce that from our rights, even though they try to. Because that's the only reason we don't go in there and sue them for what they say in Parliament. So there's this thing on that we just don't know. That's our problem.
Yeah, that's a fair enough call. And whether we do have the rights written down somewhere, whether it's the Magna Carta or elsewhere, or we don't have the rights written down, the point is our High Court is saying, as far as we're concerned, you don't even have implied rights. Like they're saying, they're not even addressing the fact that we may not have express written rights. They're saying you don't have any rights. Like that's their own ruling.
No.
And that was from earlier October of this year. And I'll be honest with you, until I started doing research for that segment for today's show, even I didn't know that the High Court had said that in early October. Now, you think about it, we spend more time discussing legislation as a group here because we want to get the information out to the viewers. So before we do that, we have to do our own research. If someone like myself was completely unaware that our High Court had said you have no implied right to association, that means that the vast majority of people have no idea that that's the case. Now, some of the vast majority of people would say, well, I don't care anyway. I trust the government, I trust the media. You know, those people are hopeless. But there would be lots of people out there saying, hold on, that actually did that really happen? That's significant. I'm going to look into that. Yeah. And that's why it's so important we get this information out. Now, we have to move on. I did want to do a big feature piece on the Chinese-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which is a very significant thing. It was announced on the Monday following G20. I'm not going to have time to go into detail about it, so I'm not going to say too much. I'd rather save the research that I've got for another show next week or the week after. But I will just make this point. If you go back to, I think it was episode 3 or 4, we discussed the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Clauses, the ISDS, foreign corporations being allowed to sue our government. We said if that gets passed in the TPP, that's bad news for all of us. Well, the TPP hasn't been signed yet. The China-Australia Free Trade Agreement has been signed, and that does include ISDS provisions, which means that Chinese corporations will be allowed to sue our government if they act in a way that might benefit us as citizens, but doesn't help their corporations. This is really significant stuff. I'll make sure we go into big detail about that next week, but I thought, even if I can't give the big detail on that today, it's worth just saying that to all of our listeners who do come to us for information. Guys, you don't have to wait for us to tell you. You can go and do your own research. I'll provide the links in the info box. This is significant stuff. We have a free trade agreement with China now, and it includes ISDS, and that will allow their corporations to sue our government. This is significant stuff.
Yeah, and just to touch on the significance of it real quick, which we'll discuss when we actually go into it, Senator Wish Wilson, who's a Green senator, said that this is a new era in Australian government. This is a new era in Australian governance. The inclusion of ISDS provisions has opened a Pandora's box that will leave a lasting legacy of doubt over the Australian Parliament's ability to make laws in the national interest without fear of litigation from a Chinese investor. And then he goes on to discuss just how how awful these laws are. But obviously we'll touch more on them, and we have touched on the TPP in the past. But this is here and now. This is like the little test dummy before the TPP then affects a broader global scale.
Well, yeah, look how easily they got away with this on Monday. This was announced, and most people have no idea. So if it was that easy to do this with China, how easy is it going to be with the TPP, especially when they've got old mate Barack Obama telling everyone how great it's going to be for them. And again, for listeners, check out our Saturday episode of the G20 Special Weekend, where we went into some detail about Obama's speech in the TPP and all the rest of it. I'll make a pledge right now. Next week, unless there's a massive 9/11 type catastrophe that stops us from spending time on the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, unless there's some really big event that takes up all of our attention, we will spend some time going into detail about that Free Trade Agreement because it is significant. But we'll leave that until next week. We have to get on to the international segment now, and I know that, Ethan, you wanted to discuss Iran and some updates to do with their foreign or domestic policy.
Yeah, just quickly, for those who don't know, Iran have been in negotiations with the US and some of their allies to speak about their nuclear arsenal and their nuclear capabilities. Now, just to give a brief background for people that don't remember, during the time when Libya was destabilizing in the Middle East, and the US were funding these extremists to go in and topple these regimes, which is blatantly evident and has been proven. They were trying to drag Iran in as well, and there was a massive media campaign about Iran and their nuclear capabilities and their ability to, develop nuclear weapons. And it got a bit hostile because the US were using that as a pretext to try and, intervene in Iran, even though the United Nations investigators said that there was no intention to do this. There was no evidence that they could ever gain those capabilities and what have you. Just for a brief background, and it did get hostile. But then in August, an election happened, and Hassan Rouhani was brought in as the president, of Iran. And then as soon as he was brought in, very ironically, all of a sudden now complete secret talks are going to be open about this, and after following all of this hostility. And the secret talks agreed to on Sunday, according to the BBC, authorised by President Obama, took place in Oman and other locations, with 4 meetings occurring since the election of the new president. The talks have been focused on measures that will constrain Iran's ability to quickly produce a nuclear bomb, but it will allow ability to maintain what Tehran insists is a peaceful nuclear power program. The key points of the deal revolve around the uranium enrichment program. Iran has agreed to halt all enrichment above 5%. Above this point, uranium can be used for research. Above 20%, and the uranium has the potential to be enriched further for use in weapons. Now, at this time, the implementation of the secret agreements will begin to take shape, and the BBC did live updates on these talks. I just thought this was really interesting, and I wanted to talk about just open up a little bit of a discussion. One, on the unusual circumstances surrounding Iran's negotiation. We talked about how it was completely hostile previously, and how all of this was, really leading to a real, catastrophe. It seemed, because Iran they were threatening to shut the Strait of Hormuz, which most of the world's oil supply travels through, and that would have been, just devastating on a global scale. And now, as soon as the new president's elected, all of a sudden, all of these talks have just opened up. Two, just how unique this is in terms of the geopolitical landscape, because now that Iran have somewhat of a relationship and are negotiating with the US, how does this tie into Russia's relations with Iran and whatnot? And, just general thoughts about the situation, and the elephant in the room that, the mainstream media continue to not tell the people. Well, here's the elephant in the room. Israel have a massive nuclear arsenal at their hands, but no one's being told about that, and there's been no uproar about that, Lindsay.
Yeah. And my reading over the last few years was that the PACs, the Israel, they come under all sorts of names, like Institute for Democracy and all that sort of thing, were pushing the American system and politicians to attack Iran, to bomb their nuclear power plants, the whole thing. It's been really insistent for a long time. So I'm just not sure what's going on here, or is there something in this for Israel and they're backing off? I'll have to go and read a bit more about it.
Yeah, look, this is a new development that I haven't had time to look into too closely, but from previous research, what's going on with Iran, of course, Senator John McCain, who was a presidential candidate in one of their elections not so long ago, you can find video footage of him, rather. Just stumbled over my words there. You can find a video footage of him, that's better, of him saying, bomb, bomb, bomb Iran. Like, he says it like a joke, like, oh, let's just go and bomb another country. I mean, it's just, it's ridiculous. You can find video footage of a key lobbyist for the Zionist movement, and I forget his name, I have my notes in front of me, but you can find footage of him, I'll link to it in the info box under the description here, where he basically calls for a false flag attack on Iran. Or, like, he actually says, we didn't get into the first war without the Lusitania, we got into Vietnam because of the Gulf of Tonkin, he goes through a list of all the things that they use as a justification for war, and then he said, maybe we should do something to an Iranian submarine or something to this effect. Yeah. And this is stuff that anyone can access online to see the kind of machinations or purported machinations that are going on. So, or at least were going on for the last few years. So for this sudden about face that you've mentioned here, Ethan, I really can't offer any more than to say that I'll have to look into it.
Yeah, well, I just found it extremely unique how all of this was happening. Iran, he was getting really hostile. I remember that speech, that press conference that was held where he said that. And I remember just the hostility and China saying it would be a direct attack against our national security if Iran is intervened, that there was warships all around Iran, and then Russia's warships were coming down. It was escalating. There was a lot of talk about how this could escalate to a third world war. Still has the potential. We've spoken about this in previous episodes, with Syria and Iran's relationship and whatnot. But then all of a sudden, as soon as the new president is elected, now all of a sudden there's negotiations with the US, and Kerry was over there and everything, and they were all photos of them all hugging and shaking hands after the secret meetings, and it was just, I just found this unique, and I thought I'd bring it up because all of a sudden everything is just completely turned to 180, and it's just it's very important for the geopolitical landscape to just bring this up and bring it to people's attention.
It's a crazy world we live in, and it got a little bit crazier, at least for people who've had their head in their sand for a while, a few weeks ago, when Al Jazeera, which is a Kuwaiti-based, I believe, media outlet, broadcast a program called The Day Israel Attacked America, or something to that effect, which was discussing the 1967 attack by Israelis on the USS Liberty, which at the time the official story was, they thought it was an Egyptian ship, which was completely different in its dimensions to the American ship. There's no way they could have made that mistake. Many people have said ever since then, well, that was clearly an intentional attack. Why would they do it? Why didn't our government investigate it, et cetera, et cetera? Well, this video that was released a couple of weeks ago on Al Jazeera included transcripts and other undeniable evidence that the Israelis intentionally attacked the USS Liberty. And some people would say, but this is, almost 50 years ago. Who cares? Well, who cares? This is very significant for a couple of reasons. One, because it goes to the heart of the relationship between Israel and the US, and who has how much power and why and what have you. But also how easy it is for the media and for the governments to keep people from questioning things by saying, well, this is the official story. That's what all the media outlets are going to publish. That's what you're going to believe. And people like us will say, well, hold on. All the evidence says the complete opposite of what the mainstream is saying. But many people are going to go with the mainstream anyhow because it's the mainstream. Well, Al Jazeera, which obviously isn't a US-based media outlet, but is a reputable outlet, did broadcast a program which said point blank, here's all the evidence. Israel knew what they were doing. And I'm sure, Lindsay, this is well within your field of expertise. You can give us some more information about that.
Yes. Maybe 15 years ago, I'd never heard of this at all. And then an old friend of mine had the book and whatever, so I eventually got a book on it and read up a little bit on it. I think the thing that upset me most of all was that I think it was Johnson intervened and wouldn't even let their own fleet come to their rescue.
The American President Lyndon Johnson.
And the soldiers or the sailors, were threatened that if you go to the media about this, you will be charged, and they've been squashed. And for whatever it is, it's a long time. They've been really resentful about the attitude the government had to them and their mates who were killed. They knew what was going on. They knew the flags were up there. They knew the US sign was on the side of the ship. They're not stupid. And it doesn't matter how the Israelis were going on about it. It's just... Anyway, they came in and they were shooting... what do they call them? torpedo boats
Yeah.
came in and torpedoed it as well.
Yeah, I probably should have given a bit of background for
Yeah.
this. For people who aren't familiar with the USS Liberty incident in 1967, and a US warship was attacked by the Israelis, by planes and by boats, which apparently was trying to sink it. They killed like 36 of the people on the boat, wounded dozens and dozens more who had done nothing wrong. That they were just on a ship that was clearly demarcated as American, which should have been aligned with Israel. And the official story was that these Israeli fighter pilots and boaters and the people in charge just didn't know what they were doing, which is absurd. So many of the big lies that we're told are absurd, but it's like what a very famous German person said many decades ago: tell a big lie, tell it often enough, and the lemmings will believe it.
Yeah. Well, with the stuff that I read, the sailors were on the deck, sunbaking and things like that. You know, obviously they were just sitting there monitoring radio signals from Israel and Egypt or wherever. When the first lot of planes came over with Israeli signature on them, they all waved and carried on. Oh yeah, they were our mates, until they started shooting hell out of them, strafing them. So they were in no doubt whatsoever. If they could read the Israeli signature on the planes, they knew that they could read the US flag and on the ship. They knew what they were doing.
Yep.
Yeah, well, there was radio transcripts and evidence that, hey, this is a US ship. Yeah, we know. Keep shooting.
Going. Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah.
The instructions were to keep shooting it. And it's just, it's completely absurd to say that this would be by accident.
Undeniable evidence that they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
And they continued doing it anyway. And then, of course, that leads to questioning, well, what was their motivation? And I highly recommend that people go and check that documentary out. It covers it in far more detail than we could hope to right now. But the point is, even big mainstream organisations are now happy to discuss this almost 50 years on.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for many people out there, until the mainstream admits that something happened, they're never going to believe it. Well, for our viewers out there who aren't familiar with this particular incident, who I'm sure are far more open-minded than the average person, if you haven't heard of this one, go check it out, the USS Liberty. It's very revealing, A, for what it tells us about the power politics between those two nations involved, but also just for how easy it is to convince the lemmings to believe nonsense, whether it's with false flag attacks or hoaxes, which provides a nice little segue onto our final topic for the international segment today, which is these blatant false flag hoaxes which have taken place in the US over the past week. Are you guys familiar with this shooting, so-called school shooting in Florida?
I haven't heard that one.
I know that many of our listeners are Max Resistance and We'll Do It Live fans, and I'm sure they're all familiar, but basically, Ethan, do you want to give our other listeners who aren't familiar with it a background to what's happened here?
Well, I only just saw it briefly, but immediately straight after there was people just saying, well, look again, they're not even trying to cover this up. I don't have the specific details, so if you want to go through it, John.
Look, basically, a few days ago, the official story is that a conspiracy theorist lost his mind, went into a school that he was a former student of, and shot a couple of people. And one of the survivors was saved by a library book that he happened to be holding. And none of the story makes any sense whatsoever. The number of blatant false flag psyops that have taken place in the US this year is staggering. I mean, they did the Sandy Hook, they did the Batman shooting at Aurora, they did the Boston bombings, 3 massive false flags. And it was like, wow, look, I don't know the word for it, but to think they could get away with it, and then to largely get away with it, that was crazy. But this year has just blown those 3 out of the park. They had that Elliot Rodger here shooting. They had that Cassidy Stay shooting. They've had this one, and that's just 3. They had the Moncton ones in Canada. Obviously, here in Australia, we had that southeast Melbourne Newman Hayter incident. Yeah. I mean, it's not just been happening in America; it's been happening around the world. The number of blatant false flag psyops. The point I'm trying to get here, it goes to what I was saying earlier, is they seem to be in a rush. Yeah. They're in a rush right now, and whenever you have, whether you think that they're an enemy or an opponent, or just a government that's lost its way, whatever your way of understanding all this is, you have to ask yourself, why are they in such a rush? Yep. What's going on?
And people need to think that there's a reason for everything. All of these little small things happen for a reason. And that's what, when I briefly saw it, immediately mine went to the notion that it was a conspiracy theorist. And we've talked in previous episodes about how non-violent extremism, beliefs that question the system, such as 9/11, we have the same ideological viewpoints that ISIS's viewpoints could, thrive in, how the Foreign Fighters Bill is attacking freedom of speech, how preachers of hate need to be banned, and then all of a sudden now so-called, quote, conspiracy theorists are coming out and doing school shootings, and it's painting the picture. It's continuously painting the picture that we are the enemy. And first it was the bikies, next it was ISIS. Who's going to be next? Anyone that questions the system. And I am afraid to live in a world where if the media can pull it off so well that people will walk around and say anyone who questions the system are a threat to us, and they need to be, and we can be arrested, we can be detained, we can be anything now under these new laws. That was the first thing that jumped out of me. What do you think, Liz?
No, I agree. I think it's probably also this disarmament thing in America. They're really big on that. Yeah. They're pushing that like mad. And just during the week after Obama mentioned that immigration, there was a group, I don't know where I read it, one of the websites anyway, there was a group of people who were talking about going with their guns to the White House and arresting him or whatever. So you might find they're trying to cut that off at the pass before it gets too big.
Yeah, well, obviously they know they're not going to be able to disarm all of America before, that the final incident, however that one plays out. The idea is, though, to make it so that just having a gun can be a crime. Yeah. So that when it comes time to try and do a mass confiscation, or it does come time to the next civil war, whatever it is that's coming, I don't pretend to know, that anyone who can defend themselves can be locked up as well. Yeah, that's the plan. That's where they're going with this. But as you said earlier, they've always got one or two agendas at play at the same time. Yeah. Not only are they trying to make people more scared of guns to take them away and to pass ridiculous laws like AB 1014, which we discussed in the previous episode, at the same time they're trying to demonize the conspiracy theorists. And how easy would it be for them to print an article saying that, say, us three wanted to kill someone? They could mention a couple of books in your library at home. Yep. They could show a photo of Ethan wearing his beanie. They could show a photo of me wearing my beanie. And really, that's all you have to do. Put a headline, crazy conspiracy theorist who believed 9/11 was an inside job, attacks whatever, and a lot of lemmings would just believe it. They just would just
it's
straight
scary.
Off the bat.
It's scary because I increasingly can see a world where that is happening, and that's what they want. It's with this Global Patriot Act saying that non-violent extremists, anyone who questions the system, are a threat. They're coming for us. David Cameron has made that clear in his speeches. We've talked about over and over again. They're coming for people that question the system. That's why we need to build a community. That's why we need to share, information with each other. That's why people need to start their own podcast, because as a unified collective, we're harder to take down than if certain individuals are doing it. If certain individuals are doing it, but if everyone's doing it, it becomes harder to take down. If a community can be built to stick together, it's harder as a unified effort. And this is so vital. While we still have the chance, I'm dead serious, we need to make an effort to try and, get this information.
Yeah, and there's lots of good people out there who know a lot of things that we know, have their own views, can do their own research, which is the most important thing. Can you think for yourself? Can you read a book? If so, well, you're on our side, and they will come for you eventually. We're the ones who are the overt ones. We're doing a show. We discuss all of this. Sure, we're, if you want to put it this way, at the front lines, but you guys are also there as well. Basically, David Cameron declared war on you. If you think for yourself, if you do your own research, if you think, to use his words, that this was David Cameron's words, that 9/11 was a Jewish plot, or that the 7/7 official story was false. If you believe that, if you ever posted about that on your Facebook or on a social media, maybe if you ever discussed it on the phone, well, guess what? He was declaring war on you as well, not just us. Yeah. So now's the time to buy yourself a microphone, do a podcast, get in touch with us. We'll promote your show. We'll promote your show on our show. We've got hundreds of subscribers already. Why have we got hundreds of subscribers? Well, because we've networked with people like We'll Do It Live and the Match Resistance Roundtable, and they've promoted us. And the community's growing very quickly. Get on board now. Be part of this. It's a fantastic thing. I enjoy it. I learn something every day. This morning I learned that New South Wales an appeal against the New South Wales anti-association laws was knocked on the head by a high court. That's it. That's an incredible thing. I learned that today by doing research for this show. This has been an amazing experience for me. I love doing it. And all you listeners at home, we've got, 10 viewers listening live right now. By the end of the week, we'll have hundreds of people listening to this. There's no reason why you can't do this show, and I, for one, hope that you do.
Yeah. I agree. No, it's important to just keep reiterating, because you can be arrested for your ideologies and beliefs now under this Foreign Fighters Bill and this Global Patriot Act, which is going to come to every country that's on the Security Council. They've said they're going to have to enact laws that prevent preachers of hate. So now's the time.
What I like seeing you young fellas doing this is that my generation, they've only got to wait 20 years and we're dead. That's what they're thinking. That's it. Yeah. Whereas they really do get upset when new people jump out of the box, because they think they've got the young already screwed through education. We've got them under control. Well, suddenly you start jumping out of the box and they get worried about it. we're going to have to wait for another 30 years or whatever. And that's what they don't like.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that's a good way to wrap up that little segment of the show. Now it's time to move on to our final thoughts, because already we're at the end of the show. So we'll move straight to you, Lindsay. Do you have any final thoughts you want to finish the show with before we wrap it up? Oh, yeah, of course. Oh, yeah. Okay,
have you got time for that? Or not?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of minutes.
Okay,
next week is the referendum in Switzerland to institute almost like a gold standard, to force their central bank to hold gold. We will be doing, the plan is next week, all going well, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the monetary system, real estate, etc. But you want to just give a quick little briefer on that for us?
Yeah. I just I get an email comes out from the local bullion dealer called Ainsley, and that was just to remind people that only 2 weeks away to the referendum, and it's going to have a fairly far-reaching effect. Doesn't matter which way it goes. And they're saying that already the yes vote is ahead. Whether it'll stay ahead right up to the day or not, I don't know. But the other thing too was that the amount of gold and silver that's going into India and China is just unbelievable. Every month it becomes a record. And I think that's what we've got to keep in mind too. So this whole idea that the prices are down and because there's no demand, there's massive demand, the whole thing is being manipulated. That's pretty much.
And our listeners should also know that none of us keep any gold at our houses, and if we did, it'd be in a safe, and don't come for us. So that's, Lindsay, that's your final thought. Again, I do want to say we're going to do a big thing about that gold referendum, because that's huge, and it's not being covered by our media for an obvious reason. We're going to do a big show about all of that next week. Look forward to that, viewers. Ethan, any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, I just want to say once again, thank you to everyone that's tuning in. You know, we genuinely appreciate the support, and I'm not saying that as a loose thing. You know, we genuinely appreciate that people want to tune in and listen, and that a community is building that want to spread information. It does, it's so refreshing, because I've been in Australian alternative media for ages, and it never used to be like this. It used to be very, very hard. It was only a select group of people, a tiny little audience you couldn't get anywhere out to. So now that more people are getting involved, and shows like this at the beginning is just fantastic. So thank you once again for tuning in.
I haven't had a chance to check it, but you were telling me before the show that you took a clip from one of our shows and put it onto your TOTT news site, and it got, 700 views, something like this?
Almost 750 views.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? Yeah. And that is happening. Again, you don't have, I don't know that well, I don't think you have 750 friends. That is from people who hear this, who have never met you, saying, I like what this guy's doing, I like what these guys are doing, I'm going to share it. That is from our listeners doing the hardest part of all, which is to get the word out there for us.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
No,
I can't thank them enough. And if you go through the stats, you look at it, our first show had about 230 views, the second one 140. Since then, it went 200, 250. Episodes 5 and 6, 350 views. The combined G20 special, over 600 views, 40 likes. Again, that's just from you people out there listening to this right now. That's from you saying whether I agree with them or I disagree with them, or I agree with this bit or disagree with that bit. That's from people saying it's important that this stuff gets out there to have an alternative. I'm going to share it. And so I want to reiterate what you said, Ethan. I'm so thankful of the listeners for supporting what we're trying to do. Because at the end of the day, we're doing this for us. We're all in this together. Whether we're on this side of the microphone or the other side, or hopefully going to get onto this side of the microphone, we are all in this together, whether or not we realise it.
And shout out to Jaden.
Well, speaking of that, I want to say thanks to the live listeners, which we've had between 10 and 12 all day. We haven't had the live chat box open while we've been doing this show. So we're hoping that you guys have behaved yourself in the chat box and haven't given YouTube or Google any reason to shut us down yet. Again, next week, a big show. We'll talk about that free trade agreement. It's huge. We'll talk about money. Look forward to that, listeners. And again, remember that we do this show here in Australia, and it's largely based on what's happening here in Australia and international as well. We'll Do It Live is on the Wednesday night. That's Thursday morning. The Massachusetts Roundtable is on Tuesday night American time. That's Wednesday morning Australian time. Just like us, their shows are available on YouTube if you can't listen live. Check those guys out. They're doing it just what we're doing, but they're focused on America and Canada. And when you see the similarities, that's when the similarities of what's happening over there to what's happening here, that's when you realise we're not just in this together, us, the peasants of Australia. We're in this together, the peasants of the Six Eyes. We've got a vested stake in supporting each other, so let's support the other people who are doing work like this. That's all I had to say. Thanks again to all the listeners. Lindsay, thank you so much for coming in today.
That's right. It's my pleasure. It's been quite rewarding.
And Ethan, thanks again for coming in and all the good work you do.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.